We continue our series of the Musar movement, the movement of ethical perfection. Like everything in Na'aleh, is Lili Mishas Rachalea Bas Rav Chaim Tzvi Alei Shalom. We want to thank Mrs. Bromser from the studio, and of course Mrs. Claver, who is the brains behind everything, and so much despising when we acknowledge her. But what can we do? It's all thanks to her and her wonderful family that so much Torah is disseminated through the wonderful offices of Na'aleh. We pick up again with Yisrael Salanter. In 1845, in Vilna, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter outlined his program for ethical rejuvenation of traditional Jewry. It's now 1 century after the Hasidic Revolution, and Hasidus just was marvelous to take people that were in the dumps, on the down and outs, and pick them up and give them spirit, and make Judaism something very vibrant in their lives. Yisrael Salanter has severe problems to deal with Jewry, and he's hoping that it's the Musar movement which will make a difference. So 1 century after the Hasidic Revolution, the Musar movement was to be the parallel revolution of the Misnagna, of the opponents of Hasidus. Now, his goal is very clear. He wants to elevate and bring up Jewish religious life by restoring the primacy of ethical precepts as the key to meaningful religious observance and Torah study. He envisioned the defeat of reform, of the so-called Enlightenment, not by attack, and not by dispute, and not by invective, as by the inner restructuring of the traditional camp on superior ethical and behavioral grounds. We're not going to argue, we're not going to engage in diatribe. We're going to just prove to them that those who observe Torah law are on a higher plane through their observance and their moral sensitivity. And that was the plan. In the 1840s, the so-called Enlightenment was really on the ascent. Nowhere was this more evident than in Vilna. That was the epicenter of the so-called Enlightenment, where a number of the Haskalah leaders lived, and they were active in propagating their cause. Now, as can easily be understood, these leaders of the so-called Enlightenment were fascinated by Reb Yisrael Salanter. He wasn't a cookie cutter. He wasn't a person that was so obviously just only yeshiva. He had broad ideas. He cared about everyone and thought he could be a very important ally for their cause. They were fascinated by his personality. They were fascinated by his philosophy. They were quite certain that somehow they could make him become one of their allies. This was a fatal mistreating of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, and that would eventually force him to leave Vilna. By 1849, early 1849, Salanter was already residing permanently in Kovna. He was aware, I'm talking about Yisrael Salanter, that the Haskalah would eventually lead to reform, assimilation, conversion, and ultimately, bottom line, it would lead to self-annihilation. It can't go together with Judaism. It's not going to happen. But he was also aware of the social and educational failings that were present among traditional Jews. So again, his solution is going to be, he saw, as we spoke about last time, he saw things that everyone saw, but he looked at it differently. He had a different take. Something has to be done. So there's something fundamentally wrong. People focusing on their service to God, but what about neglect towards a fellow person? People only want to correct the other person. So he said, you point the finger at someone else, you're pointing 3 fingers at yourself. First, repair and correct yourself. Then and only then you can start and reach out to your other person. But reach out by caring about his material well-being and not his spiritual. Their gashmias, that's my ruchnias. You worry about the physical, that will bring about ultimately to spiritual. Much like Hasidus, the language and the outer garb of Musar were new, but its inner core is as old as Sinai itself. And that's why he was opposed. He was opposed because what's the point of creating a new program and giving prominence to something which fundamentally already exists? You're not saying anything new. What? Mesilas Yesharim was around far before Yisrael Salanter. So was the Chovos HaLevavos. So what are you saying which is new? That people have to be ethical? The Torah says that. But it wasn't being observed. That was his point. His followers and students were loyal to him, and they built the Musar movement. And they attended yeshivos and institutions in the spirit. As Beryl Wine points out, fundamentally he did not succeed in one area, what he intended, but yet he did succeed in another. His idea to make a mass ethical movement that would change the life and raise Jews become much more morally sensitive. That didn't happen, not as a mass movement. But where he was successful was he developed students that were very devoted to him, and they were able to propagate the Musar movement. And that's where we're going to continue, not in today's class, but in the subsequent classes, going to 3 schools of Musar and their various approaches, all of them very different. Well, taking his idea and refracting it a different way of how to interpret the Musar movement and how to implement Musar teaching. So, again, originally the Haskalah, the so-called Enlightenment, hoped that Musar would become their ally. But the Haskalah ultimately was rebuffed, not ultimately, really from the outset. Salanter rebuffed the whole idea of the Haskalah. And the Maskilim opposed Musar then with derision.